Thank you all for coming to this brief talk. I'm Tessa. I'm going to go through a site visit that I did to some research sites in the Feather River Basin. I used these sites during my dissertation work, starting in 2016 and going through 2019. And over the course of a couple different fire seasons, all of the sites burned. And so I'm going to kind of show a little bit of what they looked like prior to the burns, and then just some photos that I have of the impact that the fires had, largely based on, or largely related to the Dixie Fire, but there was one site that burned in the North Complex Fire a year ago. So the original installations looked something like this. We had 4 sites that were on either side of the North Fork, and that's this branch, and then the east branch of the North Fork, which ran along here. And this is the Feather River that drains into Lake Oroville down here. So the Humbug, Kettle, and Grizzly sites all burned in the Dixie Fire, and the Bucks Lake site burned in the North Complex Fire. Humbug was completely destroyed in the Dixie Fire, so I'm not going to show any photos from that, but we'll look at the other 3 sites in this presentation. Those sites consisted of a set of sensor nodes, which looked like this. So these were lightweight installations that were measuring a variety of different climate and snow characteristics, and they're designed to be able to measure these across the landscape. So each site had multiple different locations where we were taking data to get a sense for what was happening at different slopes, elevations, aspects, and canopy covers. So there's quite a bit of electronics and stuff that went into these, including the guts of the whole thing where the data was stored are in this box. Each site also included a base station, which is what this looks like. So all of those sensor nodes that we had were reporting their data back to the base station, which had a cell antenna, and that went out towards to a server in Berkeley. So we were actually sort of collecting this data in real time. So the aerial view of all of this basically has, the blue is the base station and the red are all of the sensor nodes. And you can see what this landscape looks like. This is the Bucks Lake site. The lines here are just radio connections and how the data were being sent. So nothing physical connecting any of the nodes. But you can see that they're, pretty spread out among this area. And the other thing I'll draw your attention to is the vegetative cover in this area and what it, how many trees and how much vegetation there was before the fire. These sites see a lot of extreme weather. So this was the winter of 2016 to 17, which was an unprecedentedly wet year in California. And we saw so much snow, in fact, that the sensors almost stopped reading data because we got to the point where they were saturated. So that's another, just the extremes that this landscape can experience. So we'll start with the Kettle Rock site in terms of the fire damage to the site. This is the footprint of the Dixie Fire overlaid on the Feather River Basin. And this gray dot is where Kettle Rock is. So it's at the peak of this, 7,800 feet. So here's some pre-fire photos of the site, similarly vegetated to Bucks Lake. And these are similar photos to the post-fire, where basically you can see that it was definitely a crown fire. The trees are burned all the way up. There are no leaves on the top of the trees, so it's not heat that killed them. It was the fire itself. And the ground was completely, there wasn't really any dirt left. It was basically just ash. And this was, I think, the most severely burned site of any that we looked at. So it's fairly apocalyptic. This is one of the remains of one of those sensor nodes, and possibly the most damaged one at any of the sites. So, they're not standing up anymore. This was the pole. This was the box with the guts, right, with the data loggers and the batteries. And, you can see the remnants of the battery pack and the way that the fire kind of melted the fiberglass. which is what the box was made out of. This is the aluminum pole that was holding them up, so it looks like plastic almost in this photo, but it's not. It's actually aluminum. This site had a little bit of greenery around this spring. This spring used to be almost inaccessible because of all of the brush and growth surrounding it. And when we walked there now, it's completely obvious. And I think another, we can see that either the fire spared a little vegetation or the vegetation has regrown since then around the water, which interesting little bit of fire break. But the other thing you notice immediately is we used to be able to drink out of this spring water. You could get into it, it was very clean, but you can see the algae starting to accumulate on the top of the water already, which to me, sort of indicates eutrophication. Post-fire nutrients can wash into these waterways, and so this is an example of how the post-fire landscape, if it's not managed, can damage the water resources. This was just kind of a cool photo of a tree that was in exactly the right spot, like on the edge of the fire. It's like the fire probably, the heat and the fire damaged one side of it and not the other. On the road to Kettle, we came across an interesting area that had been treated a little bit. I'm not entirely familiar with what the treatment was, but the ground here was a little bit burned, but had been, cleared prior to the fire, had been cleared of ground cover, and it was interesting to see how that contrasted with areas that hadn't been cleared out. So less severe fire in this area, and most of the trees survived, whereas deeper into the forest that hadn't been cleared further from the road, the fire was much more severe. So this is kind of a panoramic of that. And like back in this area, it was a crown fire, and it looks like it slowed down as it approached this treated area. We also came across some areas that were still smoking. So this tree is still burning up a little bit. So pretty soon post-fire, and yeah, still noticing the fire effects. The next site, Grizzly Ridge, is down towards the edge of the fire on the southern end, and it was a little bit less severely burned than Kettle Rock. So we still had some of these nodes that were standing. This one looks pretty good. The sensor up here, which was measuring temperature and relative humidity, is a little bit melted, and so is the snowed up sensor. This node was only 20 feet away probably, and interestingly was not in quite as dense an area, but was impacted much more severely. Also saw this node we think fell prior to the fire, and for whatever reason there was a bit of a trail to it from the fire. We're not entirely sure why this one patch of ground burned, but it did. This site was interesting. It has we had the base station in a meadow in this site, and the photo on the left is pre-fire and the photo on the right is post-fire, and they don't look all that different. And it's interesting to see how the meadow did exactly what you would expect it to do in terms of slowing down the fire, and everything. I think all this is dry because of the drought and not enough water, but the base station was basically unharmed and still had full battery after the fire. So then we can hop over to Bucks Lake, which is the North Complex fire. So it's outside of the footprint of the Dixie Fire, but south where the North Complex burned in 2020. So you can already see some signs of regrowth at Bucks Lake, and also in the background here, they were doing some post-fire management and timber harvesting. So that's what that looked like. So the base station, which as you recall was in a pretty forested area and has once seen incredible amount of precipitation, is now in a pretty denuded landscape and is not functional anymore. So it melted to the point it's not working. we saw some pretty severe damage to both the nodes and the base station. So on the right, that's the cell antenna that used to send data out. It it kind of looks like a horrifying weapon at this point. And then on the left, there's one of the most severely burned boxes that we saw. So the node's still standing, but you know, that's just kind of interesting to see what the fire does to fiberglass. And then as a parting shot, this is an image of one of the Canyon Creek that flows into Lake Oroville. So this is basically one of the tendrils of Lake Oroville, and you could walk across it. I mean, there's no water in it, and I've never seen it this dry, even though I started this work in 2016, you know, towards the end of the famous 5-year drought in California. So it's a pretty scary landscape at this point. All right, this is one little fern that has managed to regrow in one of the more severely burned areas. The little bit of hope at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel, maybe. All right, so that's the whole presentation and different images, and we can kind of start any questions that people have. We can start going that direction now.
Thanks, Tessa. I might kick it off just based on this last picture that you've shown us. Just based on what was out there, what did you see growing back in the sites where there was really high severity fire that went through?
This was pretty, so in the sites that burned in the North Complex fire, which were the more severe ones and also the more recent fire, I mean, it was basically like this one fern, which really caught our attention because it was the only green thing for as far as you could see, and the areas that had some water. So like the spring that I showed, and I don't know if the vegetation regrew post-fire or if it just was spared the fire. But those were, I think, were the only two like examples that I noticed. In Bucks Lake, which has had a year to recover, you saw some grasses, you saw some manzanita coming back, shrubs, but not trees.
And how soon after the fires were these photos taken?
Good question. So I visited in early October of 2021, and the Dixie Fire, it was largely contained by September, I want to say, but some of these sites might have been slightly longer for some of these sites because the fire was so big that they had contained certain areas of it before they contained the whole fire. So honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but late summer, so only a couple months. And I guess to answer your question about Bucks Lake, it's been about a year. Gosh, does anyone remember when the North Complex fire was contained last fall? I think it was a fairly late season fire, so it was burning into, October of 2020.
Yeah, that sounds right.
On December 3rd, the Plumas National Forest announced that it was 100% contained.
Yeah, so less than a year. Yeah, less than a year from the site visit.
Are there any plans to use the data that was collected prior to the fires and do a before-after study? Or do you see potential for that? And what would you like to see even?
That's a good question. So yes, actually, there are some plans. We walked each of the nodes and managed to download the data from the nodes that we're still collecting. And we have some data from each of the sites, and we're kind of interested in looking at what they were recording in terms of temperature, relative humidity, and solar radiation during the fire periods, because we do have at least one node that survived every site. So that will be really fascinating. And then we were actually out on this site visit with some folks from UC San Diego who are going to be taking these sites over and rebuilding some of the nodes. And so the goal in the long run could be to, like, they're particularly interested in soil moisture. And so I think they're going to plan to rebuild all of the equipment, but there's a really interesting opportunity here to see how soil moisture and soil temperature will evolve in the years post-fire. So I didn't go into the details, but these were measuring soil moisture and soil temperature at 25 centimeters and 50 centimeters depth. And so we can turn around and look at, is there water penetrating the soil at this point, or is the ash creating basically an impermeable surface? What was the soil temperature like during these fires, particularly comparing the different depths? That's something I'd be really interested in, is, how deep into the ground was the fire felt, essentially. The other thing that I would be personally really interested in is how these fires will affect snow accumulation. We can look at different years and across the different sites. Even though California sees huge variation in year-to-year precipitation, the distribution of snow across the landscape is relatively similar year to year. So if you normalize, you can even look at just a couple years, even if they're not sort of representative of the average precipitation or whatever we like to talk about in California, even though that doesn't mean very much. And so we could do the same thing post-fire and take a look at a couple years of data and see if, the change in albedo because of the fires will impact snow accumulation.
And just for the non-terribly scientific among us, can you explain what albedo is just really quickly?
Yes. So albedo is basically the reflectance of the surface, which is kind of a measure of how much energy it's going to absorb. So surface, the two extremes would be like a perfectly white surface and a perfectly black surface. And so the white is going to reflect solar radiation back to the atmosphere and not accumulate as much heat, and black is going to absorb it. And that's why you're supposed to wear white t-shirts and not black clothing in the summertime, right, to stay cool. But what happens after a fire is, you can see this ash is very dark. So there's the concern is that the albedo will change to absorb more heat, and that would impede snow accumulation, because then it's kind of like why snow doesn't accumulate on roads as fast as it accumulates on grass. And that's because the road is warmer because it's dark. So similarly here, the concern is, okay, well, the snow's not going to accumulate on this warm surface. And snowpack is pretty critical for water resources and storage in the Western US. And so that's kind of it creates this feedback cycle where you have a severe fire, you have, as a result, maybe less snowpack. That's influenced by many other things, but that can lead to less snowpack because of the albedo change. The less snowpack you have, and the earlier it melts out, the drier your landscape is late season, which then, of course, makes it more fire prone.
Do you know if there were any sort of landslides in this landscape or post-fire events that are really changing the waterways and beyond just the total loss of surface soil?
Yeah, good question. So, in the Feather River in general, there were landslides in the atmospheric river / bomb cyclone that California had later in October. And there were some photos of, landslides and roads washing out across the Feather River. That storm also apparently washed out the road to Kettle Rock. So all of the photos I saw, all of that site, it's totally inaccessible right now, which is, kind of interesting. I don't know if that particular landslide impacted water, but in general, I have no measurements. I don't know if anyone has taken measurements, but I know that some of the landslides happened in corridors that were right by, say, the North Fork of the Feather River, which is pretty much the main stem. So my expectation is that, yes, there's additional sediment accruing in the river because of those landslides that was probably more susceptible because of the fires and loss of vegetation.
Tessa, I have one additional question. I mean, as you think about the impacts that you saw and were able to measure sort of from these sites, and then as you look forward to sort of handing this project off to the folks at Scripps, how is this experience, how is this this experience on this landscape and what you've been able to see here affecting or impacting the way that you're thinking about projects that you're working on at Blue Forest?
Dang, Peter, big question. Yeah, I think it really hammers home how little we know about a lot of effects of fire on water systems in general, or we know what the potential effects are. But there's a lot of fire can do this to the landscape. It can make the albedo change. It can increase an impermeable surface. It can make it more susceptible to landslides. But do we know that that's going to happen in the post-fire landscape? How susceptible is it going to be? If the landslide happens, is it going to impact, say, Oroville Dam in a measurable way where we could turn around to the Department of Water Resources and really make a case for them investing in a post-fire landscape? So because of those uncertainties, it's a little challenging to think through, how do we manage a post-fire landscape in terms of Blue Forest model of engaging a beneficiary and really understanding and quantifying what their benefit from the work is. So that's, certainly highlighting a big need that I think if that sort of nut was cracked, then there would be a lot of potential for applying a model like this or a model like the Forest Resilience Bond to a post-fire landscape in an area like this that has a lot of implications for water supply. So just for some background, the Lake Oroville is the keystone reservoir in the State Water Project, which supplies water to cities in Southern California, metropolitan water, and provides some ag water to the Central Valley, and it's managed by the Department of Water Resources. I'll turn some questions back on Peter and Andrew. Are there any things you notice in these photos, because you're both foresters and know more about the trees and the fire aspects than I do, because I've talked a lot about like the water related impacts, but I'm kind of curious about your commentary or thoughts.
So, like Tessa, I also worked in the Feather River watershed for a season, one field season, not 5 like her, but in a forest and fire ecology capacity, and worked in what was called the Moonlight fire, which burned several years earlier, and I think that was in the early 2010s, and the result was a lot of catastrophic fire, high severity, and similar to the landscape that we're seeing in these photos, just total vegetative loss. I mean, the trees, as far as you could look, were all dead. And so when I was working there in 2018, we didn't see regrowth. Part of our job was to go out and look to do transect studies, so putting out lines and finding if there were trees that were falling within a certain distance of that line. And we weren't. We could go 6 hours without finding any new tree regrowth, and this is several years after the fire. And what we're looking at is land type conversion. So long term, a lot of these places aren't going to be forests anymore, and that's not true of all of California. That's not true of all of the Northern Sierra even, or this watershed. But it is a growing reality of land type conversion. And I think like, these images just bring that back, and it's a fast forwarding to maybe 3 to 5 years from now. I see that same landscape of just shrubs, of 6 foot tall shrubs.
And just to share, additionally from my perspective, what I see when I'm looking at these pictures is the legacy of the systematic suppression of fire over the last 100 years. Functionally, fire is part of this landscape. It should be as common as rain or any other natural phenomena that determines how this vegetation and how this landscape should look. But the effect of keeping fire out for 100 years is about the same as if you shut off the rain for 100 years. You're going to have a really significantly changed landscape, and a landscape that's going to be much more susceptible to events like this, events that are much more severe and intense than they might otherwise be in the absence of a legacy of a century's worth of fire suppression. So in some ways, I also see this as a bit of a call to action around the necessity of reintroducing fire to these landscapes and finding ways to reintroduce fire in a way that won't make this kind of high severity, high intensity fire more likely across the entirety of the Sierra Nevada, to say nothing of the rest of the American West.
Do either of you have thoughts on, perfect world with unlimited capacity and funding, what would you do to prevent that land type conversion?
If we could wave a magic wand, I mean, I would want to get a lot of input from the communities about what it is that they'd want to see. I mean, I don't think that there is a single silver bullet to the problem of how do you restore forests across an entire landscape. A lot of it is going to involve input from folks about what they want to see, what kind of objectives are important to the communities that rely on these forests, whether that's native communities or folks who happen to live in towns and cities or in the wildland urban interface that's adjacent to some of this forest land. I think you need input from a lot of different folks, and the prescriptions are going to look different depending on where you are. And that's even the case in post-fire contexts as well. What people want to see after a big fire goes through is really dependent on what they want that community to look like going forward. I think the challenge of planning is that you have to commit to something that's going to take more than 50 years or 100 years to look like even a facsimile of what we have lost in some of these fires. In a lot of cases, we're never going to be able to see these forests look the way that they did before the burns happened. But we can, I would like to hope, lay a groundwork so that folks can adaptively manage the forest that's around them going into the future. And we're not limiting the options of folks 100 years from now by the decisions that we're making presently.
I think just going off of what Peter said, I think it's both of his responses to the first question and the second tying in together, right? It's what can our communities, what they want and what is socially acceptable in these places, but ultimately we have to have good fire back on the ground. I mean, the amount of land that we're talking about, and so when we say restorative action, we're talking about a lower density of small material, right? Fewer small trees or medium-sized trees, and in a forest that's a lot more open. And so I think while we're not planning the projects, everything that we're doing, and when we say forest restoration, we are promoting projects that bring good fire back to the landscape, manageable fire, fire that doesn't burn every inch of topsoil off for as far as you can see. And instead, it's actually restoring nutrients to the ground and is burning in a patchy and diverse way. So I think that's the vision, is bringing that to the landscape scale. How and how soon can we do it? I mean, that question of time is so vital right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much for any forested landscape in the western US at this point, minus maybe some parts of the Western Cascades, maybe. But it's sort of a question of when and not if.